For decades, Richard Carpenter carried a silence heavier than any melody he ever composed. The world knew him as the genius behind the Carpenters, the gifted arranger, the pianist, the man whose harmonies defined a generation. But few ever glimpsed the sorrow he hid behind that polished smile, because behind every soft piano chord was the echo of a sister's fading heartbeat. Karen Carpenter's voice could move millions. It was pure, haunting, and fragile, like crystal glass that shimmered with every note, yet cracked under the weight of perfection. The world adored her. Her family relied on her, but no one truly understood the quiet suffering that consumed her life. Richard watched it all, from the front row of fame and from the darkest corners of grief. For years he said nothing, not about their mother's coldness, not about Karen's desperate cries for love, nor about the secret pain that fame had magnified. But time has a way of demanding truth, and now, decades after her death, Richard has finally broken the silence. What he revealed reshaped everything the world thought it knew about the Carpenters, and about the gentle soul whose songs hid unimaginable loneliness. Karen Carpenter was born on March 2nd, 1950, in New Haven, Connecticut, a little girl who would one day give the world one of the most tender voices ever recorded. Her brother Richard, born in 1946, had already become the center of the Carpenter family's universe. By age 4, Richard could identify any note on the piano. By 5, he was composing music that stunned adults twice his age. Their mother Agnes adored him. She filled notebooks with his achievements, bragged to neighbors about his gifts, and treated every performance like a sacred event. But when it came to Karen, things were different. She was often dismissed as the loud, playful child who banged on pots and pans in the kitchen, not the musical one. Even as a child, Karen could feel the imbalance, the quiet favoritism that hung in the air of their modest home. She once wrote in her diary, "Mom thinks Richard is Mozart, and I'm just noise." Their father, Harold, worked long hours in the printing business. His salary, about $7,200 a year, barely covered the family's needs. But when the chance came to move to California, Agnes didn't hesitate. She sold their Connecticut home for $12,500 and used nearly all of it to buy a modest house in Downey, California, a move made not for comfort, but for Richard's future. In letters to relatives, she wrote endlessly about her son's promise in music, but rarely mentioned Karen at all. At just 13 years old, Karen found herself in a strange new world, sunny California, far from her familiar East Coast roots. Her accent made her stand out at Downey High School, and her shyness made it worse. She often sat alone during lunch breaks, lost in her own world. But destiny was waiting, in the form of a school music class. When a drummer suddenly quit, Karen asked to take his place. Within minutes, the band director realized this quiet girl had a natural sense of rhythm. She mastered drum patterns in weeks that took others months to learn. By the end of that year, she was performing complex jazz numbers like Caravan and Malagueña, but even then her mother's indifference didn't change. While Richard received a $750 Baldwin piano, Karen practiced on borrowed drums. Her passion nurtured not by encouragement, but by sheer will. She didn't know it yet, but those drums were the first step toward a sound that would change music forever. By 1965, Richard Carpenter was 19, a musical prodigy arranging jazz compositions with surgical precision. His 15-year-old sister, Karen, had become a force behind the drums, her timing flawless, and her energy electric. Together with bassist Wes Jacobs, they formed the Richard Carpenter Trio. In 1966, their performance of Richard's original piece, Ice-T, won the Hollywood Bowl Battle of the Bands, a moment that should have launched them straight into stardom. But the industry wasn't ready. Their clean, melodic jazz sound clashed with the rising tide of rock and psychedelic music. RCA Records gave them studio time and then walked away. Still, fate had other plans. One night, during a rehearsal, Karen sang a simple ballad, "I'll Be Seeing You." Her brother froze. The drummer he had known his whole life suddenly revealed a voice unlike anything he'd ever heard. Smooth, aching, utterly pure. Richard realized that her voice was their future. By 1967, they reinvented themselves as a spectrum, experimenting with harmonies and pop arrangements. Record labels, however, kept rejecting them. Too soft, they said. But Richard persisted, crafting every arrangement around Karen's warm contralto. He believed the world would eventually listen. He was right. In 1969, a demo of their slowed emotional cover of Ticket to Ride reached Herb Alpert at A&M Records. Captivated by Karen's voice, Alpert signed the siblings on April 22, 1969. Karen, still only 19, was so young her parents had to co-sign the contract. Their debut album, Offering, later reissued as Ticket to Ride, wasn't a massive hit, but it introduced the world to something entirely new. A sound both intimate and cinematic, carried by the kind of voice you didn't just hear, you felt. That voice was about to make history. By the summer of 1970, they released They Long to Be Close to You. Within weeks, it soared to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, staying there for 4 weeks straight. The Carpenters had arrived. Their follow-up, We've Only Just Begun, became an anthem for a generation, a song of hope, love, and new beginnings. Couples played it at weddings, radio stations couldn't stop spinning it, and soon Karen's soft contralto became one of the most recognizable voices in America. But success came with a cost. Behind the gold records and Grammy Awards, the very same perfection that made them famous was quietly consuming them both, especially Karen. The year was 1970, and the Carpenters were everywhere. Their harmonies filled radio stations, wedding halls, and television screens. They were America's sweethearts, the wholesome siblings whose music sounded like comfort itself. But behind those smiling faces, cracks had already begun to show. Karen had always felt safest behind her Ludwig drum set, hidden behind the cymbals, where the spotlight couldn't reach her. On stage, she could lose herself in rhythm, a shield against her own shyness. But audiences wanted to see her. Managers insisted she step forward to become the face of the Carpenters. By 1972, the decision was made. Karen would sing up front, leaving the drums behind. To the world, she was radiant, graceful, modest, the perfect image of a young American star. But inside, she felt exposed. "I consider myself a drummer who sings," she once said. But even that identity was being taken from me. Richard, meanwhile, was the perfectionist behind every note. He chose the songs, crafted every harmony, and drove his sister relentlessly. Their work ethic was unmatched, but so was the pressure. In 1973 alone, the Carpenters performed 174 concerts, recorded an entire album, and appeared on multiple television specials. Karen was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Her soft-spoken nature made it hard to protest. She simply pushed herself harder, smiling for the cameras while her health quietly declined. And through it all, their mother Agnes remained unchanged. Even as Karen's voice became the centerpiece of their success, Agnes continued to praise only Richard, her brilliant son. To her, Karen was simply lucky to sing alongside him. The public saw perfection. Behind closed doors, Karen saw only a mirror reflecting everything she thought she wasn't. By the mid-1970s, the weight of fame and of her family's expectations had become unbearable, and soon her body would begin to show what her heart had been hiding for years. By the mid-1970s, the radiant image of Karen Carpenter began to hide a terrifying truth. Her once glowing face grew thinner, her body frail, and yet she kept smiling, kept performing as if the show itself could hold her together. Audiences gasped when she walked on stage, not because of her fame, but because of her fragility. In 1975, the Carpenters abruptly canceled their European tour. The official statement said exhaustion, but those close to the family knew better. Karen could barely stand. At 91 pounds, she was collapsing under the invisible weight of a disease few even understood: anorexia nervosa. In an era when eating disorders were barely spoken of, Karen's illness was dismissed, misunderstood, and hidden in a silence. The media speculated about mystery illnesses, and fans sent letters of concern. But inside her own home, compassion was scarce. Still, the world continued to celebrate her. In 1975, Playboy magazine held its annual readers' poll. Shockingly, Karen was voted the 10th best drummer in the world, even ranking above John Bonham of Led Zeppelin. When Bonham reportedly mocked the result, Karen only smiled and said softly, "I hope he's not too upset. I love Led Zeppelin." But deep down, the poll was bittersweet. It reminded her of everything she'd lost: her drums, her identity, her sense of control. Behind the music, her family life grew darker. When she began therapy with Steven Lovenkron, a leading psychotherapist in New York, he invited her parents to join a session. Richard looked at his sister and said the words she had waited a lifetime to hear: "I love you, Karen." But when the therapist turned to Agnes, the mother whose approval Karen had chased since childhood, there was silence. Agnes couldn't say it, not even then. Karen's eyes filled with tears. Richard would later say that moment haunted him forever. And yet, even as her body weakened, Karen's soul burned with creative longing. When Richard entered rehab in 1979 for his own battle with Quaalude addiction, Karen saw her chance. For the first time in her life, she would make an album that was entirely her own. She flew to New York City, working with legendary producer Phil Ramone, who had shaped the sounds of Billy Joel and Paul Simon. The sessions were electric. Karen experimented with jazz, pop, and disco influences, singing sultry, confident lyrics that revealed a woman breaking free. Even Paul Simon was impressed by her voice, tweaking lyrics for her rendition of "Still Crazy After All These Years." Friends who heard the tracks were stunned. "This is Karen like we've never heard her before," they said. For once, she was truly happy. But when she returned to Los Angeles to share her work, the dream shattered. Richard, freshly out of rehab, felt betrayed. The executives at A&M Records, including Herb Alpert, called the album unreleasable. Karen was devastated. Her solo album was shelved, and she was billed $400,000 for the recording costs, deducted from her own royalties. The rejection broke her heart, but the heartbreak that followed would destroy her completely. Just as the dream of her solo career collapsed, Karen thought she had finally found love, the one thing she had always longed for, but never truly received. In June 1980, she met Thomas James Burris, a real estate developer 9 years older than her. He was charming, elegant, and said all the right words. To a woman whose life had been controlled by others, Burris seemed like freedom. Within 2 months, they were engaged, a whirlwind romance that stunned even Karen's closest friends. She dreamed of a family, of holding children in her arms, of finally being loved for who she was and not for the songs she sang. The wedding took place on August 31st, 1980, at the Beverly Hills Hotel. The photographs captured a radiant bride in white lace, smiling beside her handsome groom. But just days before the ceremony, Karen had discovered the truth, a secret that shattered her heart. Burris had undergone a vasectomy years earlier and had no intention of reversing it. For Karen, who dreamed of becoming a mother, it was a cruel betrayal. In tears, she turned to her mother for guidance, but Agnes Carpenter, ever cold and pragmatic, refused to listen. "The invitations are out. The family reputation is at stake," she said. And when Karen cried that she couldn't go through with it, her mother's reply was ice cold. "You made your bed. Lie in it." So she did. Karen walked down the aisle with a broken heart, determined to make the marriage work. But what followed was not love. It was torment. Burris was not the successful man he had claimed to be. He was drowning in debt and soon began borrowing large sums from Karen, $35,000 here, $50,000 there, draining the fortune she had built from years of touring. At dinners, she arrived wearing dark sunglasses, hiding the bruises of tears, not blows. Friends described her as trembling, fearful, and deeply ashamed. Burris mocked her frail body, sneering, "You look like a bag of bones. No one else would ever love you." The words cut deeper than any wound, and Karen, already fragile, began to crumble. By 1981, she was consuming nearly 90 laxatives a day, along with thyroid pills under false prescriptions to speed her metabolism. Her weight plummeted to 77 pounds. Desperate, she finally admitted to Richard that she needed help. He arranged for her to meet Dr. Stephen Levenkron again, and Karen flew to New York to begin an intense therapy regimen. Levenkron confiscated her pills, monitored her diet, and worked to rebuild her shattered self-image. But the recovery was painfully slow. Karen wanted to get better, but she also wanted to get better fast. The spotlight was waiting. The cameras were waiting. The world was waiting. And Karen still believed she had something to prove. By September 1982, she was admitted to Lenox Hill Hospital. Doctors placed her on intravenous feeding, and within weeks, she gained 30 pounds. But the sudden change was too much for her weakened heart. It began to fail. Still, when she returned to California that winter, she smiled and told friends she was feeling better. They believed her. She wanted them to. But her body was already nearing its final limit. By December 1982, Karen Carpenter seemed to be on the mend. She had regained weight, her smile had returned, and for the first time in years, there was a quiet spark of hope in her eyes. On December 17th, she performed Christmas carols for her godchildren and their classmates at the Buckley School in Sherman Oaks, her final performance. Those who were there remembered her as radiant and cheerful, laughing softly between songs. Then, on January 11th, 1983, she attended the celebration for the 25th anniversary of the Grammy Awards. She wore a pale pink gown, smiled for photographers, and told friends, "Look at me, I've got an ass." It was said with humor, but it meant something deeper. A fragile woman clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, she had finally beaten her illness. That night, friends like Dionne Warwick recalled her energy as almost childlike, full of life. 3 weeks later, she visited Richard. They talked about the future, new songs, a possible tour, rebuilding the Carpenters brand. Richard saw a light in her he hadn't seen in years. They hugged, said goodbye, and promised to talk soon. That would be their last conversation. On the morning of February 4th, 1983, at her parents' home in Downey, Karen was getting ready to sign her divorce papers. She went to her closet to choose a dress. Moments later, she collapsed. Her mother called for help. Paramedics arrived to find her pulse barely beating, 6 times per minute. She was rushed to Downey Community Hospital, but it was too late. At 9:51 a.m., Karen Carpenter was pronounced dead. She was only 32 years old. The autopsy revealed heart failure caused by emetine toxicity, the result of years of abuse from ipecac syrup, a substance used to induce vomiting. Her body had simply given out. Her funeral took place on February 8, 1983, at the Downey United Methodist Church. Nearly 1,000 mourners filled the pews, friends, fans, and fellow artists, including Olivia Newton-John, Petula Clark, and Dionne Warwick. Her estranged husband, Thomas Burris, placed his wedding ring into her casket, a final gesture that some found tender, others hollow. Karen was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Cypress, California, and later reinterred beside her parents in Westlake Village. For Richard Carpenter, the loss was unbearable. He had been there from her first rehearsal to her final breath. He told interviewers later, "It felt like I had lost half of myself, but perhaps the most haunting moment came when he remembered that therapy session, the one where he had told Karen he loved her and their mother could not. That silence," he said, echoed louder than any song they had ever recorded. Still, Richard carried on. He dedicated his life to preserving her legacy, remastering their albums, releasing compilations, and in 1996, finally allowing Karen's long-shelved solo album to be heard. It became a bittersweet reminder of what might have been. The album she called Our Record with Phil Ramone. Today, decades after her death, Karen Carpenter's voice remains one of the most beloved in music history, warm, haunting, and timeless. But for Richard, every melody is both a tribute and a wound, a song for the sister he could not save. More than 40 years have passed since Karen Carpenter's fragile heart stopped beating, yet her voice still breathes life into every melody she ever sang. From Close to You to Rainy Days and Mondays, her songs remain woven into the fabric of American memory, tender, nostalgic, eternal. But behind those harmonies lies a story of perfection, pain, and silent sacrifice. A woman whose voice touched millions, but who never received the love she needed most. And a brother who carries that weight to this day, the silence of guilt, the echo of loss, and the bittersweet pride of legacy. Richard once said in an interview, "Every time I hear her voice, I hear the joy, and I hear the sorrow." In 1996, when Karen's long-hidden solo album was finally released, listeners were stunned. They heard a side of her the world was never meant to. Confident, sensual, free. It was as if she had left behind one last whisper. This is who I truly was. Even now, generations who never saw her perform still feel her presence. Her voice drifts through radios, movies, and streaming playlists, timeless proof that vulnerability can be more powerful than perfection. Behind the music, behind the fame, behind the tragedy, there remains the memory of a gentle soul who wanted nothing more than to be loved, to be heard, to be seen. Karen Carpenter's story reminds us that even angels can break beneath the weight of expectation, and sometimes the most beautiful voices are the ones that come from the deepest pain. If her songs ever touched your heart, if you've ever found comfort in the sound of her voice, tell us in the comments which Carpenter's song means the most to you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the voices that the world adored and the secrets they carried in silence.